The moment I stepped into the courtroom, I felt every pair of eyes flick to me. But the ones that cut the deepest were my parents. They didn't even bother hiding their disdain. Mom rolled her eyes so sharply, I swore I could feel the sting, and Dad let out a sigh that seemed to echo my failures before I even spoke. I straightened my shoulders, forcing a calm I didn't feel, but inside, a storm was brewing. Years of being overlooked, of being dismissed whenever I tried to matter, all pressed against my chest. I remembered staying up late to help with college, applications, missing dinners to cover shifts, and never once receiving acknowledgement. Their contempt had always been quiet, sneering in subtle gestures or words disguised as concern. Now, as I walked past them, I could almost see the unspoken message: "You're nothing." But today, despite the humiliation, something inside me ignited. I wasn't just walking into a courtroom. I was walking toward a reckoning, a moment where every slight, every betrayal, every whispered insult would be accounted for. And for the first time, I felt a cold, steady certainty that they weren't ready for what was coming. I couldn't stop my mind from drifting back as I waited for the judge to call the case. Memories of birthdays where my parents barely glanced at me, always more interested in celebrating my cousin's latest accomplishments, gnawed at me. I remembered the day I graduated high school, hoping they'd be proud, only to hear Dad mutter, "It's fine, I guess. Your brother did better." Mom had barely smiled, busy snapping photos of my cousin in a designer dress. Every achievement, every milestone, seemed to vanish in their eyes unless it reflected well on someone else. I could still hear her voice, sharp and dismissive. "Why would I brag about that? It's not like it's impressive." Even the little things, the soccer trophies, the science fair medals, were met with a casual shrug or a glance that suggested I wasn't worth their time. I thought about the nights I stayed up tutoring my siblings, the weekends I gave up to volunteer, the hours I spent helping with family events that went unmentioned, invisible labor that never earned a word of thanks. My chest tightened, remembering how alone I felt in those moments, the sting of favoritism sharp as a knife. And yet, all those ignored sacrifices had built me, bit by bit, into someone who wouldn't be ignored again. The courtroom wasn't just a room full of strangers. It was a stage for every injustice they had buried with a smile. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the fluttering in my stomach as the reality of why I was here settled in. It wasn't just a casual disagreement or another family argument. I was here over my father's estate, the one they'd always assumed I'd barely notice. The house I grew up in, the family business that had consumed so many of my childhood weekends, and the inheritance they believed I didn't deserve, were all on the line. Mom had waved me off when I first mentioned my intentions, smiling that infuriatingly sweet smile that always preceded a cutting remark. "Why waste your time? Everyone knows that part goes to your brother," she said, as if my opinion didn't matter, as if I had no right to claim what was mine. Dad had chuckled the same way, leaning back in his chair like it was a joke, a game that was supposed to amuse them. Their arrogance was thick, palpable, and it burned under my skin. They expected me to fold under their condescension, to blink and let them decide for me. But as I sat there, hearing the murmurs of the courtroom around me, I realized they had miscalculated. I wasn't here to beg or to plead. I was here to assert, to challenge, and, if necessary, to take every ounce of what I had been denied. Every smirk, every dismissive glance, every ounce of disbelief they carried into this room was fuel, and I could feel the fire rising. Today was about more than property or money. It was about finally being seen, finally being counted, and finally demanding the respect they had long withheld. I sat in my car for a long minute after walking out of the courthouse lobby, palms numb from clutching the file. The building noises felt distant. Inside my head, the plan rehearsed itself like a script on loop. Doubt tried to wedge in, small, polite whispers that I was out of my depth, that my parents were better at this game, better at hiding the truth. I let that voice speak for a heartbeat, then closed the door on it. I had learned to answer fear with work. I laid out the documents on the passenger seat as if arranging armor. Receipts, bank transfers, an old contract with a shaky signature. That suddenly meant everything. Each brittle page was a piece of the story they thought they'd buried. The ritual of sorting calmed me. It turned panic into procedure. I rehearsed the facts silently, not to perform, but to steady a voice that had been trained for so long to stay small. Preparation felt like power. Paper felt like proof. Flashbacks came uninvited. Nights I missed with friends to help at their shop. The way my suggestions got laughed off in family meetings. Birthdays where I stood on the edge while others basked in light. Those memories were acidic, corrosion to my confidence. But in the planning phase, they were currency. I began cataloging them. Dates, conversations. The times they praised my brother for things I had done. Shame transmuted into evidence. The same moments that had made me doubt myself now mapped a path. Doubt wasn't eliminated. It returned like an insistent caller. What if the judge dismissed me? What if my witnesses flinched? Each question had a countermeasure. Corroborating. Emails, a friend ready to testify, a ledger that matched my memory. My strategy was built on redundancy. If one thread was cut, others would still hold. I pictured the courtroom as a stage where I did not need to shout. I only needed to place each fact precisely where it would be undeniable. There were smaller, colder parts of the plan I told no one about. Not traps, exactly, but calibrated moves meant to expose their arrogance. A witness would mention a gift that never arrived. A ledger would surface after a casual, dismissive comment. A photograph would contradict the story they practiced at family gatherings. I felt a strange mix of guilt and exhilaration about those moments. The guilt came from the intimacy of pointing out wounds. The exhilaration came from reclaiming authorship of the narrative they had overwritten. I rehearsed how I would hold myself. Steady, unembellished, clear. Anger flared easily in private. In court, I wanted clarity. Clarity has a gravity that spectacle lacks. I practiced the rhythm of sentences that would not beg for sympathy, but would insist on being heard. I imagined the look on my mother's face when a ledger undermined her polished narrative, the pause in my father's voice when a detail he'd relied on unraveled, not revenge for its own sake, but correction. To rebalance a scale they had tilted for years. When the courtroom doors opened and the murmur of people swelled back into the present, my hands were calm. I felt armored not by bravado but by preparation. Doubt still lived in the corners, but I'd given it a smaller room. I slid the documents into the folder and stepped forward, determined they would finally see the parts of me they had always dismissed. I trusted the work I had done, and waited. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, a scent that made my stomach twist with nerves and anticipation. Rows of wooden benches stretched before me, filled with strangers in muted suits, their murmurs weaving a low hum that pressed against my ears. At the front, the judge's bench rose like a small fortress, her eyes scanning the room with the calm authority of someone who had seen it all before. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the dust in tiny golden beams, and I felt each step I took echo loudly against the floor, like a heartbeat announcing my presence. My parents sat together near the front, their posture impeccable, their expressions a practiced mix of smug confidence and casual superiority. Mom's lips were pressed into a faint smile. One corner quirked upward as if she were privately amused at the thought of me failing. Dad leaned back, arm draped over the back of the bench, eyes half-lidded in boredom, as if he'd already won the game before it began. The contrast between their confidence and my own nervous energy was stark, but it didn't intimidate me anymore. Instead, it reminded me how long I had spent being underestimated, how long they had believed they could dismiss me with a glance. "Please rise," the bailiff called, and a hush fell over the room. I straightened instinctively, feeling the weight of everyone's attention shift to the front. The judge's eyes met mine briefly, a neutral curiosity flickering across her face. "We are here to address the dispute regarding the estate of Mr. Jonathan Carter," she began, her voice steady and even. My parents' eyes glinted with satisfaction, certain I would fumble, certain I would crumble under the formalities of the court. The prosecutor stepped forward, adjusting his glasses, and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs argue that the distribution of assets has been improperly handled, and evidence will show favoritism and mismanagement by the heirs." Dad's smirk widened imperceptibly, and I could hear Mom whisper, "They'll fold under pressure, just like we thought." I felt a quiet thrill, a tension-building spark. They thought they were untouchable, that their authority was absolute. But as I opened the folder in my lap, feeling the weight of every document, every meticulously prepared piece of proof, I reminded myself that the room's attention had shifted. Whether they realized it or not, I had presence now. As witnesses shuffled in and the legal staff began arranging exhibits, I caught snippets of whispered conversations. "She doesn't have a chance," someone murmured behind me. Another voice added, "Parents like these always win." I bit back a smile. The irony wasn't lost on me. The room, the structure, the ritual of law, all of it had a rhythm, a pace, and I had spent months learning it, anticipating each move. While my parents basked in assumed dominance, I was already several steps ahead in strategy, calculating, observing, preparing for the moment their arrogance would betray them. The court, so formal and intimidating at first glance, felt like a stage now. A stage where the underestimated player could finally turn the tables. The proceedings began, and almost immediately, my parents leaned into their practiced roles, each movement radiating confidence. Mom's voice was measured and sweet, every word carefully chosen to sound reasonable while dripping with subtle condescension. "Of course, we only want what's fair," she said, her eyes flicking to me with a thinly veiled smirk. Dad chimed in, shaking his head lightly. "I just hope this doesn't get too confusing for you. We'd hate for you to misinterpret anything. They were performing the part they'd perfected over decades. The benevolent, reasonable parents who had somehow been wronged by their own child." The courtroom seemed to sway slightly in their favor, and I could feel the weight of their arrogance pressing down like an invisible hand. Inside, I stayed still, heart hammering but mind sharp. Every syllable, every glance, was a window into their strategy. I noticed the micro-expressions they couldn't control, the twitch of a jaw, the slight flare of nostrils when they thought no one was watching, the way their fingers tapped the bench in barely perceptible impatience. Each one told me more than their words ever could. I cataloged it silently, filing it away for the moments when it would matter most. They made little digs at me with surgical precision, tiny barbs meant to provoke a reaction, to make me flinch or stumble. "We always appreciated your enthusiasm," Mom said with exaggerated sweetness, even if results sometimes didn't match expectations. Dad added, "We just hope your memory of events aligns with reality this time." They rolled their eyes when I didn't respond vocally, expecting me to rise to the bait. Instead, I let the silence speak for me, a quiet, calculated presence that contrasted sharply with their performative dominance. As I listened, my internal monologue ran in quiet, precise observation. They think they control this room, but control is never absolute. Each word they choose to belittle, each glance meant to intimidate, is a thread I can use. They've underestimated the value of patience. They've underestimated me. The suspense tightened like a drawn bow, and I could feel the courtroom leaning into the tension, anticipating an eruption that hadn't yet come. Every smirk, every subtle eye roll, was only increasing the weight of their eventual downfall. Even as they continued, I felt a slow, rising satisfaction. Theirs was the arrogance of assumption. Mine was the calm before the storm. I stayed rooted, listening, analyzing, imagining the precise moment when the carefully constructed facade of superiority would fracture, and the reversal they hadn't prepared for would unfold. The opening arguments were meant to dominate the narrative, but in my mind, I was already scripting the counterstrike that would leave everyone, including them, stunned. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the courtroom fade as a memory rose unbidden. I was 16, standing in the living room during my own birthday party, trying to smile while my parents fussed over my cousin. She had just returned from a summer program abroad, all applause and praise, and every gift I'd worked so hard to earn suddenly felt invisible. I handed them a carefully chosen card, decorated with my own handwriting, and watched as Mom barely glanced at it, muttering, "That's nice, dear," before returning to fawning over my cousin's achievements. Dad didn't look up from his drink, only nodding vaguely. The message was clear. Nothing I did mattered unless it reflected someone else's success. Another memory struck like a punch: college graduation day. I had studied through late nights, sacrificed weekends, and even passed on a family trip to help Mom organize the business accounts. When I walked across the stage, hoping for a smile, a word, anything, I got a shrug and the familiar, "Well, that's something, I guess." The sting of dismissal had cut deeper than any criticism could, planting a seed of quiet resentment that I carried like a hidden ember. I remembered the isolation. The way I felt like a shadow in my own family. Invitations overlooked, opinions ignored, achievements dismissed. Each moment a small fracture in my confidence. I had tried to speak up, to demand acknowledgement, but the response was always laughter, a roll of the eyes, or an offhanded remark that made me shrink back. Even my siblings, conditioned by the same favoritism, seemed complicit in ignoring my presence. The memory of these moments, the weight of being chronically undervalued, surfaced now with sharp clarity. It wasn't just sadness. It was the realization that I had been erased repeatedly, forced to exist in the periphery while others basked in attention. And yet those wounds had shaped me. The rejection had taught me patience, observation, and a quiet, simmering determination. Each slight, each humiliation became fuel, a ledger of injustices I would one day bring forward. In that memory, I felt both the ache of youth and the emerging strength of someone who had learned to survive despite it all, someone who would no longer allow dismissal or mockery to define them. I took a slow, deliberate breath as my moment arrived. The courtroom had been a stage for my parents' smug confidence for too long, but now it was my turn. I stood, letting my chair scrape softly against the polished floor, and placed the thick folder of documents in front of the judge. The murmurs of the audience quieted instantly, the weight of anticipation hanging in the air like a storm about to break. I felt the heat of every eye on me, but it wasn't fear this time. It was control. The calm certainty that comes from knowing you hold the key to a long-overdue truth. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline thrumming through me, "I'd like to submit these records for the court's consideration." I opened the folder, revealing detailed accounts, receipts, and correspondences that painted a picture my parents had assumed I couldn't prove. There were transaction logs showing their favoritism, letters where their words contradicted the narrative they presented in court, and even a witness statement from an accountant confirming what I'd suspected for years. Mom's smile faltered, the corners of her lips twitching, and Dad's arm slowly dropped from the bench as he leaned forward, eyes narrowing in disbelief. I could see the first cracks of panic flicker across their faces. Their carefully rehearsed arrogance, the confidence they had worn like armor, was starting to chip under the weight of undeniable proof. I felt a thrill course through me but kept my tone even, deliberate, letting the evidence speak louder than emotion. I glanced at the witness, a longtime family friend who had been hesitant at first, now standing and ready to confirm every assertion I made. The tension in the room ratcheted higher, palpable in the hushed whispers, the shifting in seats, the faint scratching of pens on legal pads. Each page I revealed, each detail I articulated, seemed to weigh heavier, pressing against the walls of their assumed superiority. By the time I finished presenting the first batch of documents, the judge leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing slightly as she absorbed the evidence. My parents' confident postures had completely shifted. Mom clutched her purse tightly, and Dad's jaw tightened as he realized the narrative they had relied on was unraveling. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for the next move. I closed the folder slowly, letting the pause stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it. The silence was a loaded tension, a quiet promise of more to come, and in that moment, as I looked at my parents, stunned, unsettled, unsure, I realized the first real reversal had landed. But I knew this was only the beginning. My parents scrambled almost instinctively, their previously polished composure cracking under the weight of the evidence I had just revealed. Mom's voice wavered slightly, a tone I had never heard from her before. "Well, that's not exactly how it happened," she said, attempting to regain control. But the confidence was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. Dad leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and barked, "That document is meaningless. You're twisting facts." His voice, usually calm and condescending, carried a sharp edge of desperation, betraying the fear he tried so hard to mask. I watched, quietly, savoring the subtle shifts in posture and expression that revealed just how deeply they had underestimated me. Mom's hands gripped the edge of the bench. Dad's face, once so smug, had tightened into lines of disbelief. Their dominance, so long taken for granted, had evaporated in an instant, replaced by fumbling defense and fractured authority. The contrast was striking. Moments ago, they had commanded attention effortlessly, their arrogance a wall no one dared breach. Now, they were exposed, scrambling to explain, flustered by details they had assumed I could never prove. Each misstep, each defensive retort, made the courtroom lean in closer, sensing the reversal, feeling the tension in the air. I remained calm, letting their panic speak louder than I ever could. I noticed the tiny, almost imperceptible signs, the tapping fingers, the quick downward glances, the slight quiver in Mom's voice when she tried to insist. "That's not true." It was as if the universe had flipped the script, and for the first time, I wasn't the child cowering in the background. The courtroom's focus shifted subtly, aligning with the new rhythm of the scene. Their arrogance had been their armor, but now it was a target, brittle and exposed. I sat silently, allowing them to unravel, knowing the most powerful part of this moment was the anticipation, the subtle horror on their faces as they realized the tables had turned. The room fell into an expectant hush as the judge cleared her throat. The gavel poised in her hand like a sword ready to strike. I felt every eye in the courtroom on me, and for the first time, it wasn't pressure. It was validation. After reviewing the evidence submitted and hearing all testimonies, the judge began, her voice calm but firm. "It is clear that the distribution of assets has not reflected the intentions or fairness due in this matter." My chest tightened with anticipation, the slow-building tension finally coiling toward release. Mom and Dad froze. Their eyes widened, disbelief etched across their features, as if the words themselves were foreign to them. Mom's lips parted slightly, a silent gasp of astonishment, while Dad's hand shot to his forehead, a gesture of helpless realization. I felt a flicker of something almost electric, a private thrill that they could see in real time. The consequences of underestimating me. "The court finds that the plaintiff," the judge said, nodding toward me, "is entitled to full acknowledgement of her rightful share, including assets, documentation, and any associated rights that have been improperly withheld. Furthermore, the evidence demonstrates a clear pattern of favoritism and mismanagement that this court cannot ignore." The words sank in like a hammer striking a nail. The victory was mine. But it wasn't just material. It was symbolic. Every slight, every ignored achievement, every belittling glance was being corrected in the most public, undeniable way possible. I could hear gasps ripple through the courtroom, the audience reacting with a mixture of shock and admiration. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, murmuring quietly about the thoroughness of my case and the audacity of my preparation. Their surprise mirrored my own satisfaction. I had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed every word in my mind, and now it was happening exactly as I had envisioned. Mom tried to interject, her voice trembling. But you can't just... Her argument died mid-sentence, swallowed by the weight of the judge's ruling and the tangible authority of the evidence. Dad's face had gone pale, and he muttered something inaudible, a whisper of disbelief that seemed to confirm to everyone present the total reversal of power. Their arrogance, once so impenetrable, had shattered completely under the combined force of facts, preparation, and timing. I sat back for a moment, letting the satisfaction wash over me. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral one. The audience's attention, the judge's acknowledgement, even the stunned silence of my parents. All of it validated years of endurance, of quiet observation, of strategic patience. I felt a rare, unshakable confidence settle into me. The scales had finally balanced, the injustice recognized, and the humiliation they had inflicted for decades now reframed as proof of my resilience. I leaned back in my chair after the gavel struck, letting the echoes of the courtroom fade into a quiet hum. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not just acknowledged but validated. Every sacrifice, every ignored achievement, every moment I had been dismissed by my parents coalesced into this singular, undeniable triumph. I thought about the long nights I spent working silently, the birthdays where I stood in the shadows, the constant sense of being second or third in importance. All of it had led to this, and for once, I could let myself feel the quiet pride that had been denied for so long. I whispered to myself, a private mantra that had sustained me through countless humiliations. I matter. I've always mattered. The words felt weighty, almost sacred, like the first rays of sunlight after a storm. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was acknowledgement, fairness, the justice I had waited years to see realized. I realized that empowerment didn't always roar. It often came as a steady, unwavering certainty that no one could take away what you rightfully earned. At the same time, a pang of sadness lingered. My parents' faces, twisted in disbelief and shame, were proof that reconciliation wasn't in the cards. I didn't feel glee at their defeat, only the bittersweet clarity that they had chosen arrogance and neglect over empathy and love. I could forgive, perhaps, but I would never forget. Their inability to recognize my worth had cost us the closeness that family should have held. Yet even in that quiet ache, I found liberation. I could finally stand apart from the shadows they cast, unburdened by the need for their approval. I understood that justice, in its purest form, wasn't about humiliation. It was about restoring balance and reclaiming dignity. I whispered one last time, softer now. I am enough. I always was. And for the first time, it felt true. Not a hope, not a wish, but a statement of undeniable reality. After leaving the courtroom, I stepped into the quiet hallway, the sunlight catching the edges of the documents I still carried like armor. The whispers of those who had witnessed the proceedings followed me, strangers whose expressions mirrored the stunned awe I felt inside. And then came the unexpected moments of acknowledgement. My aunt, who had often treated me like an afterthought, offered a tentative smile, a subtle nod of respect. Friends who had watched my struggle from the sidelines approached with genuine congratulations, eyes wide, voices tinged with disbelief and admiration. Each acknowledgement was a tiny confirmation that the scales had shifted, that the universe had finally tilted in my favor. Even distant relatives, who once overlooked me at family gatherings, now greeted me with cautious reverence. "You handled that beautifully," one cousin whispered, shaking their head. "I can't believe they underestimated you for so long." The irony was delicious. The same people who had laughed at my quiet persistence now recognized the quiet power I had amassed. Their surprise, their respect, even their envy, reinforced the lesson that arrogance never goes unchallenged. Colleagues who had doubted my abilities at work shared messages of praise, their tones tinged with awe. The whispers of my strategic foresight, my patience, and my composure traveled further than the courtroom walls, and I could feel the weight of karma settling perfectly into place. The people who had assumed I would falter were now seeing a side of me they had never expected. Every acknowledgement built upon the last, creating a ripple of recognition that was as sweet as it was satisfying. It wasn't merely about winning the case. It was about proving that persistence, intelligence, and resilience could rewrite social hierarchies, even within families that had long dismissed you. As I walked among those who once ignored me, now nodding and smiling with a mixture of respect and surprise, I felt an exhilarating surge of validation. The power dynamics had shifted, the arrogance had been humbled, and for the first time, I moved through the world fully visible, fully acknowledged, and fully triumphant. Later that evening, I sat alone in my apartment, letting the day's events settle like a soft glow around me. The documents were filed, the verdict delivered, and the courtroom drama behind me. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet empowerment that didn't need validation. It existed simply because I had earned it. I traced my fingers over the embossed leather of the folder that had carried my proof, a subtle reminder of how preparation and perseverance could transform a lifetime of neglect into undeniable recognition. Messages and calls of congratulations had arrived steadily, but I didn't rush to respond. This was my moment to breathe, to absorb not the praise of others, but the truth that I had taken my place with clarity and strength. The subtle symbols of success, an upgraded office chair, a small bouquet of flowers from a supportive friend, a well-earned promotion waiting to be formalized, reminded me that acknowledgement came in many forms, both visible and internal. I reflected on how much I had grown, how the years of invisibility and dismissal had forged patience, intelligence, and a quiet resilience. I realized that empowerment wasn't about proving them wrong for the sake of ego. It was about reclaiming my dignity and shaping a life that reflected my worth. A calm confidence settled over me, steady and unshakable, the kind that didn't require applause but radiated in every thought, every decision. I smiled softly, knowing that the journey had been painful but transformative, and that from now on, I would never allow anyone to diminish my presence or my value again. I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker as the evening settled in, and let myself feel the full weight of everything that had happened. Triumph and hurt mingled in my chest, a complicated cocktail of relief, satisfaction, and lingering sorrow. I had won, unquestionably, but the victory was not without its cost. The relationships I had hoped to mend, the recognition I had longed for from my parents, were fractured beyond repair. I could forgive them someday, perhaps. But I would never forget how long I had been dismissed, underestimated, and ignored. And yet, in the quiet reflection, I recognized the lessons the struggle had gifted me. I had learned that resilience is forged in the shadows of neglect, that preparation and patience can turn the tide even when the odds seem stacked, and that self-worth is something no one can take unless you allow it. I understood that justice isn't always about punishment. It's about balance, clarity, and reclaiming one's own voice. I whispered to myself, a soft mantra of personal truth. I survived. I endured. I prevailed. The satisfaction of vindication was tempered by the awareness that family, in all its complexities, could never always offer the validation we crave. Still, I felt lighter, stronger, more certain of my path. I had reclaimed my narrative, and in doing so, I had learned that empowerment often comes not from proving others wrong, but from recognizing your own worth and refusing to allow anyone else to define it.